And it turned green.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the second round of presentations about our articles for the 16th edition of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. And I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name is Scott Walker. I'm the editor of the journal. And I'm the editor of the journal. Jim Hardee has served as the director of the Fur Trade Research Center since 1998 and has researched, written, and presented extensively on the Rocky Mountain fur trade. He edited the journal for many years, in addition to being a frequent contributor to the journal. Now, when I first saw the title of Jim's article, The First American Mountain Man, I thought I already knew who this article was going to be about. But I was wrong.
Well, thank you, Scott. I don't know how many of you had a chance to kind of tour Pinedale. I was down at Ridley's a little while ago and I was hanging out over in the hunting department. And I heard a couple of old fellas talking about one of their recent hunting trips. And then one guy was telling him how his partner just passed out on the trail and he was laying there. He thought he was dead. And he called 911 and he says, "You got to help me. I think my partner's dead." And the guy on 911 says, "Okay, calm down. I can help you. The first thing we need to do is make sure he's dead." And there was a silence on the phone and then a gunshot rang out. And the guy comes back and he says, "Okay, now what?" So I like jokes, right? And so when I was started to think about this presentation of the first American mountain man, I thought, well, what was the first joke? And this is serious. I'm kidding you not. In 2008, there was a research group from the United Kingdom that looked into the first recorded jokes. And they found a joke written on papyrus in 1900 BC. And it was, "How do you entertain a bored pharaoh? You put naked ladies on a boat and float them down the Nile covered in netting and dare him to catch a fish." I think my jokes are better than that. So, yeah, that just no good, right? But the first American mountain man, who on earth would it be? Who does it really matter? Who does it really relate to? When you think about things that are first, okay, I'm pushing this button very good, and it's not going. The first glitch of the American mountain man. How about that? Okay. Okay. Who remembers who the first man on the moon was? We all remember that, right? Anybody remember the second man on the moon? Or when it was? Guy's name was Buzz Aldrin, and it was about 2 hours after this guy. But how about this fellow? David Scott. He was the seventh man on the moon. Nobody knows who he is. He was the first guy, him and his partner, to ride a lunar landing vehicle on the moon, but nobody remembers that either. So does it really make a difference about who the first American mountain man was? Well, probably not, but it's kind of fun, gives you a little bit of entertainment to think about. But the title itself, First American Mountain Man, that's got to go, wait a minute. We're going to have to do some definitions here. We understand what being first is, but what does it mean to be an American? Can we identify this guy? This fellow on the cover of True S magazine is Daniel Boone. They claimed he was the first American mountain man back in 2015, but the only mountains they mention in that whole article are the Appalachians. Those aren't the Rockies. Those aren't our mountain men. So when we start looking at definitions for what is an American, okay, well, we know that the Louisiana Purchase flew a lot of people right into America. Bam, we got all these people of Spanish and French lineage that were living in the Louisiana Territory. They're now Americans. That exchange of possession was December 20th of 1803. So we have a date now to kind of start looking. 1803. We don't need to look too much but farther than that backwards, but we can look forward. There may be somebody backwards, and we're going to take a look at that. But 1803 gives us a kind of a round date to start to look at. What about the Rocky Mountains? The Rocky Mountains start way up here and come all the way down into New Mexico. And we oftentimes forget about Colorado and New Mexico as being Rocky Mountains, but we got to look there if we're going to look for a Rocky Mountain trapper. We've got to go that far south. The plains, they don't count. When Henry is up on the mountain, the mouth of the Yellowstone, he's not in the mountains. Of course, that's way later, so we know there's got to be somebody before Henry, but it's going to exclude some of those guys that were trapping on the plains. The plateaus, the coastal range, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Rocky Mountains. This is one of the very first published images, according to the Smithsonian, of the Rocky Mountains. Even the term, the label Rocky Mountains, we don't see that in newspapers and stuff until after the 19th century. It was actually Alexander Mackenzie's exploration to the Pacific coast where people start going, oh, Rocky Mountains, Rocky Mountains. But this is from the 1822 Stephen Long expedition. Samuel Seymour did this engraving, and it's believed to be the first published image of the Rocky Mountains. Kind of cool. When we talk about a mountain man, we want to try to identify somebody who went into the Rockies with a discernible purpose to trap beaver, not just going out there to trade. Some guys went to trade and trap, but who went out there with traps, those steel traps first? Now, this is kind of curious. David Thompson in 1797 says that the Indians, on seeing steel traps are being successful in catching animals, start to use them toward catching beaver. Prior to that, they'd been using nets and traps made from some saplings, kind of like a fish weir almost, the real primitive kinds of traps, that or just breaking apart the lodge and clubbing them kind of thing. So steel traps start to appear around the end of the 18th century. Okay, so again, we've got a kind of a starting date to start to look for who's taking traps into the Rocky Mountains. The earliest person that I could find who was established as a trader up the Missouri was a fellow named Menard. We don't know what his first name was, and it gets spelled in about a half a dozen different ways in different records. But he went up there as early as 1778 to 1783 and got established around the Arikaras and the Mandans, and he's well known in that area. And he was reported to have gone into the Rocky Mountains, but he's trading, and he's not American. Okay, so he's interesting to look at, but he's not our guy. Now in 1804, Lewis and Clark go up the Missouri, and as they're going up, they're seeing fellas going up and coming down, going both directions with boatloads of furs. And most of those guys are traders, and most of them aren't Americans. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. But they're all getting closer and closer and closer to what we defined as the Rocky Mountains. 3 days after they left Fort Mandan in the spring of 1805, Meriwether Lewis says they run across a trio of French hunters. He calls them hunters. And when we look in period journals, we oftentimes see trappers referred to as hunters. When William Ashley advertised for enterprising young men, they were going to be hunters. Well, he didn't need 100 people to go out and shoot game. He needed hunters of beaver. So here, Lewis is also identifying these French guys as hunters. And I love how he spells. They're trapping beaver. And he says they intended to ascend with us. They're going to go with the expedition as far as the Yellowstone and then continue there to hunt on the river. And it's the first essay of beaver hunters of any description on this river that Meriwether Lewis is aware of. It's kind of interesting that Meriwether Lewis, first of all, just describes them as hunters, but says this is the first time that we know that people have gone to trap. But these aren't Americans, these are French. And they're not up to the Rocky Mountains yet. They're headed towards the Yellowstone. The kind of cute part of this whole thing is the guys on the Lewis and Clark expedition are doing some trapping as well. And they're recording in the journal, oh, we got 3 beaver today, but the French got 4. You know, so there's this little competition that's kind of going on there. And pretty soon the French guys peel off and they're not there. They don't go all the way to the Yellowstone with them after all. But Meriwether Lewis recognizes that this is the first time that he's aware of people going up to trap. And that's in 1805. Now, even though that expedition was military by occupation, several of the men on the expedition had traps. We know George Druyer, we know John Coulter, we know Collins. Several of the guys are identified by name as having traps. And all in all, over 200 beaver were either caught or killed. This is a chart of each day that guys caught or killed beaver. And the trouble with, I say over 200 because sometimes they say we caught some beaver today, the men got a few beaver today. So we can't identify exact numbers, but I can show you 201 beaver that were either caught or killed. Some are killed by shooting, some are killed by getting beamed over with a kill bolt pole. They call that the bean pole. Okay, sorry. Seaman even is successful. The dog, Lewis's dog even gets a beaver. That beaver bites him on the inside of his leg, and he almost bleeds to death. But several times the guys are out trapping. The trapping doesn't seem to interfere with their military duties, so that the captains are apparently allowing that to happen. And there's a great article in We Proceeded On magazine about the trapping in Lewis and Clark's expedition. And that's where this chart comes from. I wrote it. What can I say? Yeah. But it really lays out all the things that the guys were doing as far as trapping. Of course, we all know the story of John Coulter, and as the expedition is coming back, there's 2 guys that are headed upriver, and they're trappers, John Hancock and Joseph Dixon, Forrest Hancock, I'm sorry, and Joseph Dixon. And Coulter gets permission to join them to go back up to the Yellowstone. We don't know for sure if they got into the Rockies, but they did go up the Yellowstone, and they're trappers. So they're in the running. Those guys are in the running. The guys with Lewis and Clark are in the running. John Coulter, Dixon, and Hancock, they're in the running. But there's a fellow that shows up in the Southwest, the Southern Rockies. Remember I told you the Rockies go all the way down into Mexico. There's a fellow that shows up in Zebulon Pike's journals. Pike was there in 1809, and this fellow named James Pursley shows up. He doesn't make it into Pike's official report, but he's in the appendix. There's several pages that Pike devotes to the history of James Pursley. Pike, of course, had been looking at the extent of the Louisiana territory boundaries, especially in the southern part of the territory. And he gets a little bit skewed in where he is. He ends up in New Mexico territory, builds a fort there, raises the American flag, doesn't go over too well with the Spanish folk. But Dr. Buckley has written a book on Pike, edited, I guess, a book on Pike, and you can get lots of good information from him, I'm sure, if you have questions about Pike's expedition. But in his journal, he mentions this guy Pursley. And Pursley and his friends, two guys, had trapped along the Osage River as early as 1802. That's not the Rockies, but he's got traps. And he eventually hires on with Regis Loisel. Say that 10 times as fast as you can. And they go up the Missouri River almost to the Arikara villages, not quite to the Arikara villages. Whoops, sorry. They establish a fort called Fort au Cedre, cedar post. What does that mean? Low system reef. Do I need to be worried about that? No. Okay. Okay. So here's the Great Bend of the Missouri. Comes around. These three islands are noted as the Three Sisters. This one that's the farthest upriver is Cedar Island. And on this point of the island, Loisel builds Fort au Cedre. Now, Manuel Lisa will build a fort called Cedar Fort on that same island later. So they're different forts. Lewis and Clark visit Loisel, and they give a really good description of the post. But Pursley is assigned to this post, and then he gets pushed farther up the Missouri. He goes up even closer to the Mandans. And from there, he's assigned to go with the Paducah and the Kiowa. The Kiowa are a branch of the Sioux. We're not clear who the Paducah are, but they work their way down into what is now South Park, Colorado, the Valle Salado. It's a high mountain basin, about 9,000 to 10,000 feet, about 60 miles to the southwest of modern Denver, Colorado. And so here he is with this large encampment of Native Americans, two Frenchmen and James Pursley. And they decide, whoops, hit the wrong button. That's the button I want to hit. They decide that they're going to trap furs on the Platte River. So they're at the headwaters of the Platte, way up here in South Park, around 9,000 or 10,000 feet in the early fall of 1804. Pursley is an American. He's from Kentucky. And he's our guy. He's the guy that seems to be the first American mountain man. Pike identifies a place where Pursley says he discovered gold. One of these three little X's, this is a detail of Pike's map. This highest peak is what we now call Pike's Peak. But one of those three X's in Pike's journal, he says they ran across the signs of an encampment of up to 1,000 souls. That's that big group of Paducah and Kiowa and Pursley. So we've got evidence there on that map. And the interesting thing about this discovery of gold is apparently Pursley carried around some gold nuggets in his shooting pouch for a long time. And the Spanish guys kept getting in, tell us where it is, tell us where it is. But, you know, in his patriotic moments, he said, oh, it's got to be American territory. I'm not going to tell these Spanish people where the gold is. So, of course, we have a gold rush, Pike's Peak gold rush, but it doesn't compare anything to the California gold rush later. So he ends up, him and his two friends get captured by unfriendly Kiowa. They eventually escape. They work their way down into Taos. They're taken to Santa Fe by the Spanish officials. And he ends up becoming a carpenter in Santa Fe. He almost gets hung at one point because he makes gunpowder, which is a capital offense to make homemade gunpowder in Santa Fe. And he almost gets hung for that. But he sticks around Santa Fe until 1823. But he had been trapping in the fall of 1804. George Drouillard, the first beaver that we can definitively say he trapped in the Rocky Mountains, was in the summer of 1805. And John Coulter, the first beaver that we can say he definitively caught in the Rocky Mountains was in the fall of 1806. Now, both of these guys have trapped beaver prior to that as part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but they're not in the mountains yet. So they don't meet our definition, okay? They're early trappers, there's no doubt about that, but they're not mountain men by the definition that we've established for this paper. So, though the significance that often accompanies the idea of being first, I mean, everybody remembers Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon, but that significance didn't really carry over for James Pursley. Although, interestingly enough, when Josiah Gregg publishes his book on the Santa Fe Trail in 1844, in the opening paragraphs, he talks about James Pursley. So Josiah Gregg knows Pursley had been there before him. But that seems to be our guy, Kentuckian James Pursley, the first American mountain man by this maybe somewhat arbitrary definition, but nonetheless, he meets the criteria. Thank you very much.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but how come you didn't include the Canadian Rockies as the Rockies?
They're on the map,
Yeah, but as far as who was anybody trapping up there?
not Americans.
So then American is strictly south of the Canadian border then.
Well, the first Americans that we find trapping are Lewis and Clark, and they never got into Canada.
Right.
So
But we don't know if anybody,
there's no record. And the key part of this is, can we identify it from the written record?
okay.
And that was in the early slide. I don't think I said it, but it was kind of written record show us that. So we don't have any written record of Americans going into the Canadian Rockies with traps. Well, probably. David Thompson in 1797 is saying that's about the first time they're seeing traps being used, at least by Native Americans there. So it's very likely if we were to look into Hudson Bay records, we may be able to find HBC or even Northwest Company trappers who are using steel traps in the Canadian Rockies prior to this 1804 of James Pursley, but they wouldn't be Americans, so they don't meet our criteria. Cool.
We're going to take a few minutes to switch gears here, and we'll have our next presentation. Larry Morris was born and raised in the upper Snake River Valley of southeastern Idaho. Country roamed by Ramsey Crooks, Jedediah Smith, and Tom Fitzpatrick. He's the author of The Fate of the Corps, about Lewis and Clark explorers after the expedition, and co-author of The Mystery of John Coulter, the Man Who Discovered Yellowstone, as well as numerous articles on Western exploration. Now, Edward Rose is sometimes described in sinister terms. However, his ability to adapt to the native world and survive the dangers of the early Rocky Mountain fur trade were unmatched. Natural-born Indian, The Apprenticeship of Edward Rose, 1807 to 1810, illuminates Rose's earliest years in the West as he learned the ways of trapping, native languages, and became accepted among the Crow and Arikara people. Larry Morris.
Thanks very much. Really appreciate you being here. And I'm excited to talk about Edward Rose. He was an early mountain man who came on the scene just months after Lewis and Clark returned to St. Louis in 1806. And he was quite prominent in the fur trade for the next 20 years. He has an unusual heritage. He was born of a white father and a black Cherokee mother. So he's got all three genealogies there. And from the very start of his trapping career in 1807, he had a very close relationship with Indians. And throughout the rest of his life, he often lived as an Indian. So I'm excited to talk about him today. Part of the difficulty in researching an article about Rose is that we don't have any birth date or death date for him. And we don't have anything written by him at all that has been discovered. And we don't know if he was literate. And no contemporaneous records for the 1807-1810 period have been found. So we really need to discuss Rose and to write an article about him, like I did. You need a source. And the key source on Rose was an Army officer by the name of Reuben Holmes. And he and Rose got to know each other in 1825, quite late in Rose's career, when they were both involved in the Atkinson-O'Fallon peace mission on the Missouri River to the Indian nations on the upper Missouri. And in 1829, this Reuben Holmes published a long article about Rose called the Five Scouts. That's a name he was given by the Crow Indians after he led the Crow Indians in battle, and he, by himself, killed 5 Hidatsa Indian enemies. Holmes frequently throughout his narrative, it's really a long article, he mentions various people, and often he mentions dates, and some of those he mentions are Manuel Lisa, the great fur trader, Charbonneau, who was a member of a French trader who was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Chief Gray Eyes of the Arikara Indian Nation, Andrew Henry, a fur trader, Reuben Lewis, that's Meriwether Lewis's brother, and John Doherty, a prominent trader and later Indian agent. So we're able to kind of double check Reuben Holmes' details, and frequently we find that they're backed up by sources by or about these other individuals. Excuse me. And this is a portrait of Manuel Lisa. And by 1807, even before then, he was quite a prominent merchant in St. Louis, and he plays an important role in Rose's story. Holmes wrote that after obviously having some long talks with Rose, he wrote that Rose was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and by the 1790s was working as a boatman on the Mississippi River and in the New Orleans area. He had quite a reputation for fighting, and Holmes says he had a very prominent scar on his forehead from a fight, and also the tip of his nose had been bitten off in a fight. And before the Indians called him Five Scalps, they called him Cut Nose. But Holmes's chronology fits with what we know. And Rose first went to St. Louis in 1806. And this was before Lewis and Clark returned. They returned in September of 1806. And when Rose was there during the summer, he no doubt heard talk of Lewis and Clark. Some people were worried about him because they hadn't returned as early as they expected, and there were rumors that they had been killed. He possibly met Lisa at this time because Lisa was preparing to send a trading expedition up the Missouri River the next year. And Rose and his friends spent the winter of 1806, 1807 at the mouth of the Osage River, which is in the state of Missouri, west of St. Louis. And in May of 1807, Lisa came up the river with 2 keelboats and quite a number of men with the intent to trap the Rocky Mountains. But when they stopped there at the mouth of the Osage River, a man by the name of Bissonnette, one of Lisa's employees, deserted, and Lisa sent George Druyer, who was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, a veteran of the expedition. He sent Druyer out to find him and said, bring him back dead or alive. And Druyer shot him when Bissonnette was trying to get away. And because of that, Bissonnette died the next day. Lisa and Druyer were tried for murder when they returned to St. Louis in 1808, and they were found not guilty. It shows you something about the attitudes of how serious it was to desert from a dangerous mission where you put other lives at risk when you deserted. But Lisa selected this Edward Rose to take Bissonnette's place. And there were several Lewis and Clark veterans that were part of that voyage up the Missouri with Lisa. And when the group reached the mouth of the Platte River in present Nebraska, they saw John Coulter coming down the Missouri River in a canoe. As Jim mentioned earlier, Coulter went off with 2 trappers by the name of Dixon and Hancock when Lewis and Clark had reached North Dakota on their return journey. So Coulter had been out trapping for a year. And Lisa persuaded Coulter to join his expedition, and so Coulter went back up the river again. And Rose thus had an opportunity to see Coulter and Druyer, 2 of the best hunters and scouts on the expedition. He he got a very good chance to see them in action, and it seems that he was quite influenced, particularly by Drewyer. Drewyer was half Indian himself, and he was very good learning Indian languages, which kind of became Edward Rose's specialty. When Lisa's group reached Montana in the late in the fall of 1807, he built a fort at the mouth of the Bighorn River. That's in present-day Montana, and it's not too far from Billings, Montana. He sent several men out to make friends with the local Indians. They were Crow Indians, and he wanted to encourage trade with those Indians. And the other men who were sent out, it included both Drewyer and Coulter, eventually came back several weeks later and gave a report of establishing friendships and trade. Rose didn't come back. And there for several months, Lisa was no doubt thinking that maybe he had been killed. But the entire winter passed and the spring, and in the summer of 1808, all of a sudden, Rose turned up at Fort Raymond, the fort that Lisa had built there at the confluence of the Bighorn and Yellowstone rivers. And he had nothing to show for his trading mission to the Crow Indians. He had made friends with the Crow, given away all the trade goods, and took up life as a member of the Crow Nation and married a Crow woman. And he came back to report, and Lisa had quite a hot temper to begin with. Lisa got quite angry at Rose, and Rose didn't take kindly to it and started to beat Lisa. And one of Lisa's men by the name of John Potts, who was also a member of the expedition, Lewis and Clark expedition, came in and defended Lisa, saved Lisa's life, but then Rose seriously injured Potts. And Reuben Holmes said it took, I imagine it's an exaggeration, he said it took 15 men to get Rose under control. And this was right at the time that Lisa was returning to St. Louis to take all the shipment of beaver pelts back to St. Louis. And after that happened, Rose decided to return to his friends, the Crow Indians. And it sets up a very interesting pattern in Rose's life. He returned, he started living with the Crow in 1807, and in the summer of 1808, after this altercation with Lisa, went back to the Crow. And in 1809, a prominent fur trader by the name of Andrew Henry, a large contingent of traders and soldiers came up the Missouri River to return a Mandan chief to his home in North Dakota. And at the Arikara villages, Indian villages in South Dakota, it's kind of northern part of South Dakota along the Missouri River, Andrew Henry met Edward Rose there and convinced Rose to join up with him. So Rose went with Henry this time, back up into North Dakota and eventually into Montana, and was trapping with that group that included John Coulter and Drewyer. And in the spring of 1810, Henry's group went from the mouth of the Bighorn near Billings to Three Forks, Montana. That is southwestern Montana, where the Gallatin, Madison, and Jefferson, thank you, where those three rivers converge and form the Missouri River. And they hadn't been trapping very long when they were attacked by Blackfeet Indians. 4 of their men were killed, and they still continued to trap. And Drewier got very brave at this time and said he was too much of an Indian to be killed by Indians. He went out trapping by himself, and he got killed. And at that point, Henry and Pierre Menard, who was a co-leader of this trapping group, decided they better stop before losing more men. And Henry took a group of men and crossed the Continental Divide and went into present-day Idaho, not far from Rexburg, Idaho, and began trapping on the river they now call Henry's Fork. And Rose didn't go with Henry, but he went with a couple of trappers by the name of Champlain and Williams, Ezekiel Williams and Jean-Baptiste Champlain. He was part of their group as they left that Three Forks area. And once again, he decided he was going to stay with his Crow friends, probably in either present-day Montana or Wyoming. Well, Champlain and Williams went farther south to the Arapaho Nation and eventually ran into real problems, and most of the men on that mission were killed, including Champlain. And Ezekiel Williams survived and made it back and reported on what had happened. In 1811, Rose once again is found at that Arikara village in South Dakota. It's kind of a stopping place for him, and he becomes very friendly with the Arikara Indians, just like he did with the Crow, and learns their language, just like he learned Crow language. And he's Johnny on the spot. He's always showing up for various expeditions on their way up the Missouri River. And in 1811, it was a man by the name of Wilson Price Hunt was leading a fur trading expedition, and it was financed by the great businessman John Jacob Astor. And their plan was to make it all the way to the Pacific coast and set up a fort there to make it possible to send ships with trade goods to China. And so Rose, by this time, is quite experienced as a scout, hunter, and interpreter of Indian languages. And he signs on with Wilson Price Astorians, is what they call that group, naming them after Astor. And so he was with that group for a couple of months, and Wilson Price Hunt got suspicious of Rose and heard rumors that he planned some kind of a mutiny. We didn't ever find any positive proof of that, but he decided he would offer Rose some traps and some advance pay just to get rid of him. And Rose accepted and returned with his Crow friends. This was definitely in Wyoming. And not long after that, Wilson Price Hunt's group got lost. They were still in Wyoming. And who showed up but Rose with some of his Crow friends, and Rose helped them find their way over into western Wyoming. They continued and they went into Idaho, tried to follow the Snake River. Much of it wasn't really navigable in boats. And they split into separate groups, and eventually 3 different groups made it over to the coast where Astoria, Oregon now is. And they built a fort over there. Some of those, just a small group of those Astorians, returned the next year in 1812. And when they were coming through Wyoming, they discovered a pass to get across the Rocky Mountains going from west to east. So they were the original discoverers of South Pass. And while that was happening, Rose had returned to the Arikara village in South Dakota, and in the fall, I mean, it was the spring of 1812, Manuel Lisa came up the river again and signed, enlisted Rose once again. So you find out that maybe the description of Rose giving a severe beating to Lisa might be an exaggeration, because Lisa didn't seem to have hard feelings about him. And another thing, Lisa was famous for suing people. He had lawyers who were just constantly in court, and he had several men who signed on with his expeditions who didn't carry out their part of the bargain, and he sued them. But there's no record of Lisa ever doing that with Rose. And in Lisa's papers after he died, there were court cases or journal entries or some kind of financial record of all these people that owed him money, but Rose is not on the list. So if Lisa did give those goods away to the Crow Indians, it was something that Lisa forgave. And in 1812, Edward Rose was once again working for Lisa. And Lisa's post was in the northern part of South Dakota, just before the North Dakota border. But Edward Rose and another trapper by the name of John Doherty that I mentioned earlier, they made their way over to present-day Montana and began trapping the Yellowstone and Powder Rivers. Despite the fact that Rose had these apparent problems with Lisa, and Wilson Price Hunt was quite suspicious of Rose, other people gave positive reports about him. And both in 1823 and 1825, Rose was hired by the US Army to act as an interpreter, and those officers had good things to say about Rose. So he really ends up with a good reputation despite some complaints from Wilson Price Hunt. And Rose was really unique because he got to know people like John Coulter and George Druyer, Lisa, some of these early trappers very well. And then in the 1820s, he got to know a second generation of trappers very well, which included Jedediah Smith, Thomas Fitzpatrick, Hugh Glass. If you remember the movies Man in the Wilderness or The Revenant, those are about Hugh Glass, who worked closely with Rose in 1823 and 1824. And there's quite a controversy about Rose's death. In 1833, William Clark of the expedition was the superintendent of Indian Affairs in St. Louis, and he got a letter from an Indian agent by the name of Sanford. And Sanford wrote that 3 men had been killed on the Yellowstone River during the winter of 1832 to 1833. And the names were Rose, Menard, and Glass. He didn't give first names. Eventually, it was found out, it was thought right from the time that Glass was Hugh Glass that I mentioned earlier, and that turned out to be true. And it was assumed for many years that the Rose who had been killed that winter was Edward Rose. But Clay Landry, who's here today, several years ago, he wrote a paper for the journal, the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, and he got into the records of the American Fur Company and found the ledger where they list the first names of those 3 individuals. And the first names, there's a nice article about it in the journal. The first names were Colin Rose, Helene Menard, and Hugh Glass. So it verified that Hugh Glass was killed there. But Colin was not a name that Edward is ever known to have used. That's the only time I have found the name Colin Rose in my research of the fur trade. And I checked some key indexes and I didn't find any mention at all of Colin Rose. So that raises a red flag about making the conclusion that it was Edward Rose who was killed in 1832 or 3. And then I think there's another piece of evidence which makes it pretty clear that it wasn't Edward Rose. And this was another trapper by the name of James Beckworth. He was similar to Rose because he had both African-American and white blood. And like Rose, he became very prominent he lived among the Crow and became very prominent there. And when James Beckworth talks about this incident where the 3 men were killed, he says that he sent word to the American Fur Company officials in St. Louis, sent word for another clerk in the place of poor Rose, who lost his life in the service of the company. Well, we have no record of Edward Rose ever being a clerk for a fur company. So when you take the first name Colin and the fact that this man was a clerk, I believe it was definitely a different person, not Edward Rose. And in 1834, an explorer by the name of Zenas Leonard was returning from California. He had been on from 1833 to 34, he'd been on a long expedition to California. And before he left, at the end of 1832, he had been here in Wyoming, up near the mouth of the Shoshone River. So it's in northern central Wyoming. And in 1832, he met a man he described as an old Negro and talked to him. And the description that he gives sounds very much like Edward Rose. And when Zenas Leonard returned in the summer of 1834, after the killings that had taken place there on the Yellowstone River, and that Rose had been killed, he meets this man again and talks about how he enjoys perfect peace and satisfaction. I believe that was Edward Rose, and that's the last word we've heard of him. And I believe he likely died living among his Crow friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. I had my basic question you answered at the end, the old Negro. I was interested the whole time to hear about how race was functioning. I mean, like, to the extent his story was incredible anyway, like the moves he made in his life was all the more so if you consider that he was not passing as white, it seems, from the evidence. My question is he? What did he like literally look like? Do we know? I mean, I know you described the facial features, but New Orleans, for instance, in the early, I mean, I don't have to explain, like that's a hard place to be for some of us,
Right.
you know? And so that's just super fascinating to me. Was Holmes the author who wrote about it? I don't remember
Yes,
Yeah.
Holmes wrote that article, The Five Scalps.
Okay, so did he like spend any time specifying like what race this guy was or anything? I mean, obviously ethnicity, blood, you spent a lot of time on that, but there were people who passed as white, there were people who couldn't pass as white, and yeah. So
It's interesting, Holmes doesn't say anything about his lineage. He does describe the scars, and he says that after he went to live with the Crow, he looked just like an Indian. But that's it. That's all he says about Rose's appearance. Says nothing about his lineage. But James Kleiman, who was one of the people who got to know Rose very well in 1823 and 1824, called him a half-breed, which would mean half Indian. And it was also true of the soldier Kearney, called him half Indian. And of course, they didn't interview him or ask him anything about his past. So just based on appearance, they believed he was half Indian. And Zenas Leonard is the only one I know of who called him Negro. But Zenas Leonard didn't ask this man his name. So he didn't record it. But when he gave details of what this man said, he said he went up the Missouri with Lewis and Clark. And technically that's not true of Rose, but he went up with several Lewis and Clark veterans. And the man called the Old Negro also said he went up a few years later with a man by the name of McKinney. Well, there is not a McKinney listed in the records of the fur trade, but there are Mackenzies. And it was when many people assumed that McKinney mentioned by the old man was Kenneth Mackenzie, who was prominent in the 1820s and 1830s. But I believe it was a reference to Donald Mackenzie, who was one of the historians that Rose met in 1811. So it'd be very interesting to know more about his appearance, but that's basically what we have.
Larry, do
Yes.
do you plan to dig into the accounts of Colin Rose to see if there might be something that could connect him to Edward?
I've done some searching, but I haven't found anything at all about Colin. This is Clay Landry, who I mentioned.
I'm the guy that wrote the thing about Hugh Glass. I did a lot of research on Highland, Menard, in French, I think they'd say it, Heelan, and then Colin Rose. I was able to attribute when Heelan started. He started as a Vandenberg man a year prior to that. He was only in the business 1 year for the Ricoragati. Colin Rose, I could not find any of the ledgers. And by the way, those microfilm ledgers are indexed. They're not perfect, but they're indexed by forts and persons. So it was easy to find Glass because you just looked in the index and it told you what ledger pages he was on. Although I checked them all anyway, just to make sure. But I couldn't find anything about Rose other than the fact that the pay and stuff he received was more than this, an engage, and it didn't say anything about a hunter or a trapper. So that's all I can tell you about Rose.
Thanks very much, Clay.
Any other questions?
So there seems to be a difference between the mountain crow and the river crow, how they treated the, or how their relations developed with the mountain men. Did Rose, do you have any evidence that Rose facilitated good relations between the river crow and the mountain men versus mountain crow, or did you see that anything with his relationship with the crow that would reflect in those relationships with the mountain men?
Not specifically. We have any crow experts out there? Because I'm not certain exactly where the river crow were and where the mountain crow were.
When the crow split and started out into this part of the world, it was the mountain crow who were part of the people, the crow down here. The river crow took on that name just because they didn't want to leave that Missouri country, or I mean that Yellowstone country. And so one of the most famous of the mountain crow that everybody listens to or looks at to verify that mountain crow, there's two places. There was when the federal government came out to allocate hunting grounds. The mountain crow were given from the east side of the Continental Divide to roughly where the Tongue River is, and then south to the Sweetwater, and then north back up to the Yellowstone River. Then there was a Crow chief named Arapuish. I don't know if you've read or know who he is, but he was the one who, through an oratorial discussion with those federals who assigned the hunting grounds. Now, this is before treaties. This is just hunting grounds. I think that's 1858. And Arapuish says, this is the right place. And he goes into the right place by describing the countryside that fits within that area of the east side of the Continental Divide, down to the Sweetwater, back up to the Yellowstone River, and somewhere in the area of Tongue River. And he says about it, it's the right place. The grass is right, the water's right, the temperature, the climate, everything else, which gives a further allocation about where I live over in Du Bois. It was the right place. And he said, once you get out of this area, even the dogs won't drink the water. And so he was describing pretty well what that country is. So, and many of the trappers, and particularly the Indians, and most particularly the Crow, were the dominant Indian down the Wind River country. And more to that is that most of those names, like the Wind River, the Papaja River, the Absaroka Mountains, that's all Crow. And so, and they were the mountain crow.
And I believe that is, for both periods of life that he spent with the crow, I believe that's the group that Rose was with.
Yes, it was.
Thank you very much.
Well, this ends today's presentations. There'll be more presentations 1 o'clock tomorrow. 2 o'clock, thanks. I have a good memory, it's just short. 2 o'clock tomorrow, we'll be presenting the final two articles. And they'll be about the mountaineers' descriptions of Yellowstone early on. And, oh, shoot. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, sorry about that. Ashley's method of traveling across the prairie safely. Ashley actually developed the method for the caravans that came to Rendezvous. And that'll be at 2 o'clock. This evening, if you come by at 6:30, we will be presenting awards for those who wrote for us this year. We'll also be smoothing that into a pizza party and then right into a movie night. And tonight's movie will be a documentary about Thomas Fitzpatrick. And we're very lucky to have 5 of the 6, no offense, talking heads who took part in the production, so that following the movie, you can ask them questions about what it's like to make a documentary, or ask them questions about Thomas Fitzpatrick and anything that comes up from your watching the show. So please come in and have some pizza and have a movie with us. 6:30. Thank you.